It was nearing midnight when I left the city. The highways were deserted, save for the occasional truck rumbling past, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a knife. My only company was the hum of my old sedan and the flickering of the radio as it struggled to find a station that wasn't static. I'd driven this route dozens of times before, so I wasn't worried. Just another long drive through the country back to my small town. Nothing unusual, but that night felt different, thick, oppressive. The darkness seemed to cling to everything, swallowing up the world outside my windshield. My headlights barely pierced the black, illuminating only the stretch of road ahead of me. There was no moon, and the trees lining the road seemed to close in on me as I drove. It was unnerving, but I tried to brush it off. As I passed through a particularly isolated stretch of road, something caught my eye. A figure was standing by the side of the road, barely visible in the dim glow of my headlights. At first, I thought it was a deer or some other animal, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person, a man, to be exact. He was just standing there, his thumb raised, signaling for a ride. I don't know why I slowed down. Every instinct screamed for me to keep driving, but something about the way he stood there, so still, so alone, tugged at me. He looked harmless enough. He was tall, thin, and wore a long coat that fluttered slightly in the breeze. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could make out the pale gleam of his eyes as they followed my car. Against my better judgment, I pulled over a few feet ahead of him. He didn't rush to the car like most hitchhikers would. Instead, he walked slowly, deliberately, taking his time. I watched him approach in the rearview mirror, feeling a gnawing sense of unease creep up my spine. He opened the passenger door and slid in without a word. Up close, he looked even more unsettling. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were unnaturally wide, reflecting the dim light from the dashboard. His clothes were dirty and worn, and there was a strange, metallic scent that followed him into the car. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my hands were clenched tight around the steering wheel. "Just down the road," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded and started driving again, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence in the car was suffocating. He didn't speak, didn't move, just sat there staring straight ahead. I could feel his presence beside me, heavy and oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest. After a few minutes, I tried to break the tension. "So what brings you out here this late?" He didn't respond right away. For a moment, I thought he hadn't heard me. Then, without turning his head, he whispered, "I'm looking for something." His voice sent a chill through me. There was something about the way he said it that felt wrong off. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. "What are you looking for?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. He turned to look at me then, and I wished he hadn't. His eyes were wide and glassy, and his face was twisted into a strange, almost amused expression. "I'm looking for someone." My stomach dropped. "Whew," he smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Someone like you." I felt my blood run cold. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I glanced over at him, trying to figure out if he was messing with me or if something was seriously wrong with this guy. "I think I should let you out here," I said, my voice shaky. His smile faded, and his expression became unreadable. "It's too late for that." Before I could react, he reached over and turned the radio dial. The static that had filled the car was replaced by a low, rhythmic hum, almost like chanting. The sound was disorienting, and I felt a strange pressure building in my head, like something was trying to crawl into my thoughts. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, but my voice sounded distant, muffled, like I was underwater. The hum grew louder, the air in the car thick with an unnatural energy. I tried to focus on the road, but it was getting harder to think, harder to breathe. My vision blurred, and for a split second, I thought I saw something in the trees, dark shapes moving, watching. I slammed on the brakes, my car screeching to a halt. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to shake off the dizziness that had taken hold of me. The man beside me didn't flinch. He just stared at me, that same unnerving smile creeping back onto his face. "I told you," he whispered, leaning in closer. "It's too late." I scrambled to open the door, my hands shaking, but the handle wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as I pulled harder, my heart racing. The chanting from the radio grew louder, more insistent, as if it was coming from inside my head. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The air in the car became deathly still. I looked over at the man, but he was gone. The passenger seat was empty. I blinked, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I looked around frantically, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had never been there at all. But he had been. I could still smell that metallic scent lingering in the air. My heart was still racing, my hands still trembling. I checked the locks on the doors. They were all engaged. I sat there in stunned silence for what felt like hours, the dark road stretching out endlessly before me. Eventually, I started the car again, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I drove the rest of the way home in a daze, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see that man's pale face staring back at me. But he never appeared again. To this day, I don't know what happened that night, or who know what that man was. All I know is that something followed me down that lonely stretch of road, and sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving alone, I swear I can still hear that low, rhythmic hum in the distance, getting closer.